Welcome to the Chainsaw and Tree Trimming Safety webinar. We will be covering the requirements regarding chainsaw use and tree trimming activities, including some definitions, PPE, hazards associated with these activities, chainsaw safety, and the training that may be required to perform these duties. Our training courses are designed to assist you in complying with OSH regulations. Because of the variations that can occur due to on-site conditions or performance criteria, it is impossible for any course to cover every aspect of those potential variations. Therefore, this course does not cover everything a person should know about a particular subject, nor does it qualify anyone as a competent or qualified person. However, our courses do cover part of the information that any person must know to be effective in applying safety and health standards and practices to circumstances in the workplace. Why is chainsaw safety important for employers and employees that are engaged in these activities? According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, workers in the logging industry had the highest fatality rate per 100,000 workers in 2021 at 82.2. This is almost 23 times the average for all workers across all occupations, which was 3.6 deaths per 100,000 workers. Although all employees that may use a chainsaw on the job are not logging workers, the requirements for chainsaw usage is the same under 29 CFR subpart R 1910.266. Let's familiarize ourselves with some common definitions of terms used when performing chainsaw activities. The first term is fell or felling, which means to cut down a tree. Back cut or felling cut is the final cut in a felling operation when dropping a tree. Bucking is sawing felled trees into sections called logs. A danger tree is a standing tree that presents a hazard to employees due to deterioration or physical damage to the root system, trunk, stem, or limbs, and the direction and the lean of the tree. Limbing is simply cutting the branches off felled trees. Logging operations are operations associated with felling and moving trees and logs from the stump to the point of delivery, such as, but not limited to, marking danger trees and logs to be cut to length, felling, limbing, bucking, debarking, chipping, yarding, loading, unloading, storing, transporting machines, equipment, and personnel to, from, and between sites. A spring pole is a tree or segment of a tree, limb, or sapling under stress or tension due to pressure or weight of another object. Undercut is a notch cut in a tree to guide the direction of the tree and to prevent splitting or kickback. Yarding is the movement of logs from the place they are felled to a landing. When beginning the work shift, the following personal equipment list provided shall be required when operating a chainsaw. Before we consider PPE, we must go through the hierarchy of controls to address the hazards associated with chainsaw use. When we go through the controls, we see that PPE is the last and least effective method for controlling hazards. Unfortunately, when using a chainsaw, there are many hazards that can't be controlled, and the operator must have PPE to protect them from exposure. PPE must be inspected prior to use on each work shift to ensure it's in serviceable condition. Defective or damaged PPE shall be repaired or replaced before work is commenced. When a chainsaw is at full speed, more than 600 teeth of the chain pass a given point per second, moving up to 68 miles per hour. The employer must provide leg protection at no cost to the employee and assure that each employee who operates a chainsaw must wear leg protection constructed with cut-resistant material. An exception may apply when an employee is working as a climber If the employer demonstrates a greater hazard is posed by wearing leg protection, or when an employee is working from a vehicular mounted, elevating, and rotating work platform, meeting the requirements of 29 CFR, Subpart F 1910.67. The employer shall assure that each employee wears foot protection, such as heavy duty logging boots that are waterproof or water repellent, cover and provide support to the ankle. The employer shall assure that each employee who operates a chainsaw wears foot protection that is constructed with cut resistant material, which will protect the employee against the contact of a running chainsaw. The employer shall provide at no cost to the employee and assure that each employee who works in an area where there is potential for head injury from falling or flying objects wears head protection, meeting the requirements of Subpart I of Part 1910. Hard hats must be worn when overhead hazards are present. The employer shall provide at no cost to the employee and assure that each employee wears the following: eye protection, meeting the requirements of Subpart I of 1910, where there is potential for eye injury due to falling or flying objects, and face protection, meeting the requirements of Subpart I of 1910, where there is potential for facial injury, such as, but not limited to, operating a chipper. Logger type mesh screens may be worn by employees performing chainsaw operations and yarding. The employee does not have to wear a separate eye protection device where face protection covering both the eyes and face is worn. When employees are exposed to sound exceeding levels in Table G16, feasible administrative or engineering controls shall be utilized. If controls fail to reduce sound levels, hearing protection shall be provided. A chainsaw in operation can reach 110 decibels and would require hearing protection for regular or daily use. Most chainsaw safety helmets are now equipped with head, eye, face, and hearing protection. Employees who handle wire rope are also required to wear hand protection that protects against puncture wounds, cuts, and lacerations. The employer shall also provide first aid kits at each work site where trees are being cut, at each active landing, and on each employee transport vehicle. The number of first aid kits and the content of each kit shall reflect the degree of isolation, the number of employees, and the hazards reasonably anticipated at the work site. The following list sets forth the minimally acceptable number and type of first aid supplies for first aid kits required under paragraph D2 of the logging standard. The contents of the first aid kit listed should be adequate for small work sites consisting of approximately 2 to 3 employees. When larger operations or multiple operations are being conducted at the same location, additional first aid kits should be provided at the work site, or additional quantities of supplies should be included in the first aid kits. Flammable and combustible liquids shall be stored, handled, transported, and used in accordance with the requirements of 29 CFR Subpart H 1910.106, the flammable liquids section. Flammable and combustible liquids shall not be transported in the driver compartment or in any passenger occupied area of a machine or vehicle. The chainsaw shall be fueled at least 10 feet from any open flame or other source of ignition and started at least 10 feet from the fueling area. The employer shall ensure that each tool, including any tool provided by an employee, is inspected before initial use during each work shift. At a minimum, the inspection for chainsaws shall include the following shown in the table provided. Ensure that each employee understands and can identify the mechanical mechanisms of an operational chainsaw. Before starting the saw, ensure that controls, chain tension, and all bolts and handles are checked to ensure they are functioning properly and adjusted according to the manufacturer's instructions. Ensure that the chainsaw is started at least 10 feet from fueling area with chain brake engaged and with chainsaw on the ground or otherwise firmly supported. Drop starting a chainsaw is prohibited. While operating the saw, both hands should be on the handles. Secure footing should be maintained. Obstacles should be cleared that interfere with cutting the tree or retreating, and chainsaw should not be used above shoulder level. The throttle should be released and the chain brake on prior to retreating. The chainsaw should be off or chain brake engaged whenever it's carried more than 2 steps or on hazardous terrain. More people are killed while felling trees than during any other logging activity. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 64% of the fatalities were caused by felling trees and or limbing or bucking. Before felling is started, the feller shall plan and clear a retreat path. The retreat path shall extend diagonally away from the expected felling line unless the employer demonstrates that such a retreat path poses a greater hazard than an alternate path. Once the back cut has been made, the feller shall immediately move a safe distance away from the tree on the retreat path. Before felling begins, a felling direction should be determined with any potential hazards eliminated or minimized. A clear fall path is an important factor in deciding what direction to fell a tree. The fall path should be visualized in all directions and identify those directions that are free of other trees. Finding a clear path will eliminate lodged trees, throwback, and damage to the tree being felled, as well as the other trees, or in this case, property. Before each tree is felled, conditions such as, but not limited to, snow and ice accumulation, the wind, the lean of the tree, dead limbs, and the location of surrounding trees shall be evaluated by the feller and precautions taken so a hazard is not created for an employee. An undercut shall be made in each tree being felled unless the employer demonstrates that felling the particular tree without an undercut will not create a hazard for an employee. The undercut shall be of a size so the tree will not split and will fall in the intended direction. The type of notch illustrated here is a Humboldt, which has a straight top cut, then a bottom angle cut. An open face notch shown here has 2 angled cuts from the top and the bottom. Here we have illustrated a conventional notch, which seems to be the most utilized when felling trees, with a top angle cut and straight bottom cut. A back cut shall be made in each tree being felled. The back cut shall leave sufficient hinge wood to hold the tree to the stump during most of its fall so that the hinge is able to guide the tree's fall in the intended direction. Making the proper cuts should result in the hinge guiding the tree in the intended felling direction. Limbing and bucking shall be done on the uphill side of each tree or log on any slope where rolling or sliding of trees or logs is reasonably foreseeable. Loggers should never limb a tree immediately after felling. The best practice is to drop several trees and then refuel the saw prior to limbing to provide time for overhead hazards to come down and tension to be released from limbs. The employer shall provide training for each employee prior to initial assignment. Whenever assigned new tasks, tools, equipment, machines, or vehicles, and whenever an employee demonstrates unsafe job performance. The content of the training shall include safe performance of assigned work tasks, recognition of safety and health hazards, procedures, practices, and requirements of the employer's work site, and requirements of the 29 CFR Subpart R standard for logging operations. The employer must ensure that each employee can properly and safely perform the work tasks and operate tools, equipment, machines, and vehicles used in their job. Each employee shall work under the close supervision of a designated person until the employee demonstrates the ability to safely perform their new duties independently. The employer shall assure that each employee, including supervisors, receivers, receives or has received first aid and CPR training meeting at least the requirements specified in Appendix B of 29 CFR Subpart R 1910.266. The employer shall assure that each employee's first aid and CPR training and or certificate of training remain current. All training shall be conducted by a designated person. The employer shall assure that all training required by this section is presented in a manner that the employee is able to understand. The employer shall assure that all training materials used are appropriate in content and vocabulary to the educational level, literacy, and language skills of the employees being trained. Although there is no current Occupational Safety and Health Administration standard specific for tree trimming, employers must comply with all general industry standards, and everything we have covered up to this point is applicable for employees who are not only felling trees, but may be trimming trees. The most common types of tree trimming accidents are electrocution, falling from trees, and being struck by limbs or trees. Only qualified line clearance tree trimmers are allowed within 10 feet of energized power lines. Qualified employees are those who are knowledgeable in the construction and operation of electric power generation, transmission, or distribution equipment involved, along with the associated hazards. To become a qualified line clearance tree trimmer, you will need additional training that is beyond the scope of this webinar. When an unqualified person is working in an elevated position near overhead lines, the location shall be such that the person and the longest conductive object he or she may contact cannot come closer to any unguarded, energized overhead line than the following distances. For voltages to ground, 50,000 volts or below, 10 feet is the minimum. For voltages to ground over 50,000 volts, 10 feet plus 4 inches for every 10,000 volts over 50,000 volts. When an unqualified person is working on the ground in the vicinity of overhead lines, the person may not bring any conductive object closer to unguarded, energized overhead lines than the distances given in the previous slide. For voltages normally encountered with overhead power lines, objects which do not have an insulating rating for the voltage involved are considered to be conductive. When aerial lifts are used for tree trimming operations, ensure that they are maintained and properly set up for use, used according to the manufacturer's instructions, not used as cranes to lift or hoist tree parts or material unless designed for that purpose, and only used with fall protection equipment, including tie-off. Workers who climb trees should be trained on climbing techniques and using climbing spurs with gaffs that are compatible with the tree they will climb. They should also be trained on using a second means of fall protection, such as a work positioning lanyard or a second climbing line, in addition to using an arborist climbing line, lifting and lowering hand tools and equipment, and carrying only hand tools and equipment that are necessary for climbing should also be included in their training. In closing, employees and supervisors should be aware that all other applicable general industry standards should be followed in accordance with the requirements of the specific standard when tasks or duties make it appropriate. That concludes our webinar on chainsaw and tree trimming safety. Thank you for joining us and look for more upcoming editions.